Hi, everyone. Happy Friday. Welcome to Friday Fellowship. I hope your week has been all right. You made it. As we head into tonight's meeting, let's take a moment on our own to make ourselves present to God and to this space.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to CCF Friday Fellowship. My name is Paris. I am a third year at Pitzer, and I've been involved with CCF since my first year. It's always been an amazing community filled with also. I'm so sorry. It's all the technical difficulties today that got me kind of frazzled. But I'm really excited for tonight's talk. We're beginning a new talk series on reconstructing Christian ethics, and we're starting off real spicy, real interesting, on having a talk and a following discussion on how should Christians think about sex. So it's definitely going to be really interesting tonight. And I've also have a few announcements. Of course, this is always a running joke. It's a workout with Matt. I've heard so many amazing things about these workouts. Come go work out, like a sweat and community. I have yet to do it one day. One day I'm gonna get in there. I'm gonna get in there with Matt and work it out. So that's Saturday at 10 a.m. Let's break a sweat. Next up, spring break is coming up, and so our next meeting will be March 19th. Next Friday Fellowship is March 19th. So just the next 2 weeks, spring break and all that good stuff. But next Friday Fellowship will be continuing the series like I spoke of earlier on reconstructing Christian ethics. So it's going to be really interesting. And my final announcement, of course, yes, spring break is coming up, and we're virtual, but there will be like a spring break hangout next Friday at 7 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. So come hang out. Come in like your like beach kind of like spring break clothing. We gotta kind of simulate that. We're on spring break and we're like having fun all together. So yeah, come through. Maybe get you a nice tropical Zoom background. You know what I'm saying? And then we're gonna play games and like be in community. As always. So it's a
All right, I think I lost you there for a second, Paris. So we'll just get you at the end of the meeting again. But I'm going to jump in now. Sorry about that. Your audio dropped out. So what we're going to do now is we're going to look at the topic for tonight. And as Paris mentioned, that topic is part of our series, Reconstructing Christian Ethics. How should Christians think about sex? I am well aware that even by asking that in the title, this is kind of an eyebrow-raising message. So especially if you're watching this live or recorded and you're one of the alumni from a little while back, this is not going to sound like how you're used to me teaching about sex or what you might have heard in our fellowship a number of years ago. So yes, I think back then we used to just sort of pass on the shoulds and should nots that we had been taught without really questioning where we were getting them, and we pass that on to you all. So that is not what I'm going to be doing tonight. My goal tonight is to consider the same kind of questions as a community that many of us have in private. So about how should Christians think about sex and the various things that maybe we're pushing back on or not sure what to do with from the older traditions we inherited. I've been working on this topic for the past few years, reading books, having conversations with many of you, wrestling with what I think about it. And the truth is that I can't possibly fit everything that needs to be said into this short message. So my plan is to present and suggest a few ideas that can inform how we think about sex, and then leave space for a discussion in our CCF Zoom chat afterward, where we can actually wrestle some of those things through and think about them for ourselves, hear from each other. One important omission in this talk is that I will not be really dealing at all with issues of gender identity and sexual orientation. They might come up on the side, but I'm not going to give it a lot of attention, especially not the attention it deserves. I have presented on some of that before, and we'll continue to do that in other spaces. If you would like to see my presentation on how I became queer affirming, I'm going to include a little a QR code on my next slide. I'll bring that up right now and in the corner. Feel free to use the camera on your phone or whatever and grab that QR code, and it will give you a link straight to that other message. Why are we asking this question? How should Christians think about sex? I'm going to start with talking about the traditional evangelical teaching of sex, which is the one that I was taught and passed on for many years in my ministry. And the basic ideas are these. It is that marriage is the only appropriate context for sexual intimacy, and that any extramarital sex, meaning premarital sex or adultery, is sinful. It is a big no-no. It also means that behaviors that could lead to sex are off limits. So I was taught very strongly, there's this sense that if this is a road leading you in that direction, you shouldn't even be going down it. It's a sin to even be going down the road, even if you're not going to get all the way to the end. Because why are you going that direction, right? The next is the idea that lust, as in fantasizing about sex or watching pornography and these things, those are also sin. Essentially, if I had asked this question when I was coming up through high school and college, how should Christians think about sex? My answer would be, try very hard not to. Now, many who hold the traditional view would also say this means no masturbation or self-stimulation, and also that divorce is off limits, except possibly in a few very extreme or particular cases. And then finally, the whole package comes with this idea that sexual sin is a very big deal. It's something that we're going to talk about a lot. It's going to be when we're thinking of the big sins that you might commit, we're going to really emphasize this one. For much of the more conservative leaning church, this is basically the only category of sin or evil that gets addressed in the public sphere. So when you're talking how is the church going to engage with politics, it's going to be along the lines of defending a traditional understanding of sex. But this is not the only Christian approach to sexuality, even though if you, like me, were raised in this ideology, it may have been presented to you that way, that's what it is. My first exposure with other Christian ways of understanding sexuality was a bit eye-opening. I mean, I've gotten it from a few different places, but when I really began delving in, one of the things I came across was Bromley McClenaghan's book, Good Christian Sex. And in this book, she shares her process of coming out of growing up in a mainline church tradition, very different from the one I came from, in which sex was considered a matter of personal privacy and not something they were going to teach the youth about, except maybe to talk about safe sex or those kinds of things. And so she had to spend her essentially growing up figuring out what her Christian ethic about sex would be. Now she's a pastor, and she has this book and she teaches about these things. And this book describes how she got there. And it was wildly different for me seeing a completely different Christian approach and perspective on sexuality. Especially, I was very struck by, I was very struck by her second chapter in the book called My Favorite Feel, Pleasure as a Gift from God, which included a very different view of self-stimulation than I was taught, a much more positive approach to it. I really, when reading this, resonated with her very pithy critique of the ethic that I had been given in the evangelical side of this. She kind of summarizes it this way: sex is dangerous and shameful and sinful and a tool of the devil until the day you're married, at which point it is awesome and a gift from God. Good luck. Now, the church today has a spectrum of approaches, but even if we look back through church tradition, we see that it's been pretty inconsistent in how it approaches sexuality. So as we look back, at times in the Christian church and history in Europe, the church was surprisingly tolerant of extramarital sex. Adultery was quite common. Even priests and monastics sometimes had, or often had, sort of barely hidden sexual partners that people knew of. It was just, to me, this makes sense in a time period when people largely didn't choose their spouses, that it would be much more common that people like cheating on a spouse, that would just be much more common and maybe become socially accepted. I'm not sure how they got there. But the church has not always cracked down on sexuality the way it seems to today. At other points in history, the church has been much more extreme on about sexuality, even than conservatives today are. At points, they viewed sex within marriage with great suspicion. So St. Augustine, who was very influential on both Catholic and Protestant thought, saw that any sex, he believed that any sex not intended for procreation was sinful. In other words, even married couples should be not having sex unless they're trying at that point to produce a child. On top of the inconsistencies in church traditions, the Bible is also less clear than many Christians might think. Both the Old Testament and New Testament do make strong statements regarding sex, so it shows up in 2 of the 10 commandments. There's the commandment, you shall not commit adultery, and there's also the commandment, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife, which is sadly followed by the even more patriarchal statement, or male or female slave, or ox or donkey, or anything else that belongs to your neighbor. But it's right there, the 10 commandments, 2 times. Jesus addresses sex. In the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, he says, everyone who looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart. And of course, other New Testament authors condemn what they usually refer to as fornication, or the Greek word for that is porneia. And so you'll get statements like this one from Galatians, where Paul writes, now the works of the flesh are obvious: fornication, impurity, licentiousness, idolatry, sorcery, enmities, and so on, a big list of things that Christians are not supposed to be doing. But despite the prevalence of commands about sex, it can be difficult to draw out clear, consistent guidelines for how to actually live out a sexual ethic in our context today. For example, given how passionately the church has condemned premarital sex, you would expect to find a command somewhere in the Bible specifically saying, do not have sex before you get married, or this is wrong to do this. Except there isn't one. The whole scripture, there's not a command in there saying don't have premarital sex. Now, we can find indications that, say, the New Testament authors saw premarital sex as off limits. And that assumption may likely be included in the word porneia or fornication, that would include not having premarital sex. But the problem is that it's just not very clear. In porneia, in fornication, we're getting a package of assumptions about what's right and wrong that was apparently shared by the audience at the time, so that the authors don't feel they have to speak to it or explain or work it out, which then makes it very hard for us to draw out the principles and figure out how to navigate the new situations we're wrestling with today. For example, in those days, you just wouldn't have contact with a member of the opposite sex, and it was always viewed in a heteronormative way. You would not have contact as a young person once you'd hit puberty with a member of the opposite sex, really, unless they were a family member or you were being put in an arranged marriage with them. So they didn't wrestle with these questions like which physical activities are too far, what counts as sex and what doesn't, which is a harder question than you might think. Is everything that doesn't count as sex okay then? Like if I'm in a dating relationship from day one, is that like anything goes except for as long as there's no whatever we're going to define as sex, penetration? I don't know. How do we handle things like dating and long-term relationships? It is very hard to draw out clarity from the scripture about this. And this is made murkier because the biblical witness is not consistent and has some things that are truly strange, even troubling. For example, if we look at the Old Testament, it is clear that sex outside of monogamous marriage relationships was allowed, at least for men. So some examples. You could, if you wanted to buy a slave and have sex with them, go ahead, according to Exodus 21. If you want to take multiple wives and then have sex with both those wives and each of their maidservants, congratulations. God is on your side. God will make sure each of those women, the 4 women that you're sleeping with, has children so that you can become the father of the 12 patriarchs of Israel, as we see in Jacob's story in Genesis 29 and 30. If your brother dies before he has had a chance to produce an heir, so he's married, but he hasn't produced a male offspring yet, you are required by God in the law, according to Genesis 38, to have sex with his widow and to keep sleeping with her until she gives birth to a male heir, so that your dead brother has someone to continue his ancestral line. It doesn't matter if you're married to someone else or anything, you are now told you have to sleep with this other woman. If you go to war, I mentioned this a couple weeks ago, if you go to war and you slaughter all the men in the town, basically everyone in the town, except on some occasions, according to scripture, in 2 different occasions, you are given explicit permission to capture any unmarried girls you find attractive and take as your personal possession to come back with you. That's in Deuteronomy 21 and Numbers 21. I think that's the 2 references. It's suspicious to me that they're both chapter 21. I might have gotten one wrong. If I got one wrong, hit me up. I'll send you the right reference. I could go on and on. But the thing is, with all of these troubling commands or lack of commands, things that just anything goes, there are many, many commands that forbid you, a man, to sleep with another man's wife or another man's unmarried daughter, or to forbid a woman who's married from sleeping with anyone else. Why? Why all the specificity in that area and not these other places? That's because by doing that, if you sleep with another man's wife, you're sleeping with another man's possessions, according to the patriarchal framework of the time. And so the laws tend to focus around that violation as being a primary worry. The Old Testament picture regarding sexual ethics is not pretty. I'm highlighting that to show us that we're not getting as clear a picture from scripture as we might think. One thing that New Testament scholar Daniel Kirk points out is that this patriarchal frame is not just in the Old Testament, but it is in both Testaments. So when the authors in the New Testament talk about fornication, the reason they're not having to spell out what it is because everyone knows culturally what the violations are. And these violations are formed by a very rigid patriarchal understanding of who is and isn't allowed to sleep with whom. So we need to address the differences between the biblical context and our own, the ancient context, because things have changed. And this is one reason we have to ask the question and approach a sexual ethic in a new way. Because of birth control, we're in a different place right now. In biblical times, and actually, until quite recently, right, but prior to the 20th century, male-female vaginal intercourse risks pregnancy. Especially in biblical times, they did not understand infertility, and so you never knew any sexual intercourse could produce a pregnancy, and so and for an unmarried girl to become pregnant could devastate her life. She would become in that culture unmarriageable. She would be reduced in the future, possibly if she didn't have any brothers to take her in or something. She could be reduced to poverty, even prostitution. Or if her father did manage to marry her to someone else, it would lower her value. It would lower the bride price that the father would be given to give her to someone else in marriage. So it was a very severe thing, again, in this very patriarchal context, for an unmarried girl to get pregnant. And so the social system was set up to prevent it. They had rules and guidelines that would prevent this from happening, and they married people young as puberty. Puberty was the age. As soon as you hit puberty, you could get married. And you would have been married off by 20 years old. So somewhere in that window, they were marrying you off earlier, if better. Mary, the mother of Jesus, was possibly betrothed to Joseph at around 12 years old. Now we compare that to our context, where the average marriage in the US is around 25 to 30 years old, the average first marriage, 25 to 30 years old. That is a big gap. For a traditional Christian ethic, we're trying to live out a traditional Christian ethic, but getting married at 25 or 30, when the people who created some of this ethic were getting married between like 12 and 20, right? Lorraine and I had to navigate this distance for the 7 years that we on and off dated before we got married, starting our first year of college. Now, before now, back in the old days, our Christian leaders in our campus fellowship and we and all of our peers just took it for granted that there was no sex before marriage. That just should not happen. And we were strongly encouraged to avoid anything that might lead us in that direction. So when people would start dating, there was often a serious conversation that happened about what are your boundaries going to be? How are you going to do this dating thing to make sure that you're not too physical at all? And we had conversations about whether it was okay to kiss in a relationship. If you were going to say yes, then we had to have a really serious conversation of like, well, what's the difference between a sort of chaste kiss, versus something that might lead to other things? How about hugging? Is hugging okay? Well, are you going to do front hugs or just side hugs? And so on and so forth. And so we made these rules about what we could and couldn't do, when we could be alone and in what contexts. And despite all of this and our earnest desire to hold to these commitments, we kept failing. We just, dating over 3 years in college, it was just impossible to ever keep the restrictions that we put on ourselves, which required constant changing of and reevaluating of our rules and tweaking them and trying to find that perfect thing that we would be able to keep. And our relationship became this long drama of anxiety and failure around this thing of how do we maintain proper physical boundaries. This was the same thing that was happening for all of the Christian couples we knew who were trying to have relationships. Now, ultimately, this can be super honest and open here. Lorraine and I made it to our wedding night. So we didn't have sex till our married night. Other friends of ours didn't make it. And in some of those cases, it was a traumatic experience for them. Was it worth waiting? Maybe. I think sex became for us a very special thing that we had only ever shared with each other, and that we had to figure out together. But what would happen? I think about this now. What would if one of us died and the other one remarried? Would that then make sex with a new spouse less special? Would the fact that we'd had sex before have ruined it for that other relationship? We were told that premarital sex would ruin our relationship, but I haven't heard from many sexually active friends that they felt like having sex before they got married ruined their sex in marriage. Ultimately, I don't know. I only know what I've experienced. And I struggle to imagine how it would have been any different way. But one thing I do know is that the pain and shame and struggle we went through, there's got to be a better way than that. After all, if it was hard for us to do this, and we were super committed Christians with, I think, above average self-control, if it was hard for us to get there, how is it supposed to be a broad ethic that Christian young people and older unmarried people everywhere can follow. One U.S. government study on abstinence programs, which are generally run through churches and things, found that 88% of adolescents who made virginity pledges had vaginal sex within 6 years of that pledge. So these are people motivated enough to take the pledge, and only 12% of them were making it. Any Christian sexual ethic has to contend with the reality that people have to actually be able to follow it. And that following it can be hard, but it should also be a life-giving experience, not a destructive or harmful one. Now, my point here is not to just toss out 2,000 years of Christian thinking about sex, but we have work to do if we want a sexual ethic that fits our new and very different context. It's got to work. So in light of that, I'm now just going to suggest a few principles, which to me at least seem like helpful categories to help us think about sex as Christians. My first principle, they're mostly going to be suggestions. I'm trying very hard here to leave it open. And honestly, I don't know what rules I would give, even if I wanted to give rules, but I'm taking an open approach. My first suggestion, though, really is a requirement. It's more than a suggestion. And that is justice. Having a justice framework for our sexuality. Justice is the most neglected aspect of the traditional Christian sexual ethic. There is a gaping moral chasm in the sexual ethic that was handed down to me and so many of us. And I'm grateful for pioneers like Margaret Farley, who was a Catholic nun and a professor and a Christian ethicist, and her hugely influential book, Just Love, a framework for Christian sexual ethics. This book just really opened this door for me to thinking more deeply about this. Consider for a moment, how often has the church railed against promiscuity and fornication and lust, or campaigned in the public sphere in culture wars against liberalizing sexual norms, but then had little to nothing to say about rape or sexual assault and abuse? How many sermons have you heard that talk about sexual sin and never even mention those issues, let alone giving them priority? The result is a church culture where women who report spousal abuse to their pastors are often urged to forgive, to be patient. Don't worry, the pastor will go talk to your husband. Most importantly of all, we want to avoid a divorce. Right? Or when girls who share about rape and sexual abuse that they experience are immediately questioned about what they were wearing when it happened, or what they might have done to provoke it. It's truly disturbing. What's more disturbing is how common it is. In her book, Pure, Inside the Evangelical Movement That Shamed a Generation of Young Women and How I Broke Free, Linda K. Klein shares stories like these from hundreds of interviews she conducted with women who had been raised in purity culture churches and heard stories like these time and time again. There's a reason we have scandal after scandal in the church with priests and pastors and other Christian leaders around sexual misconduct. And it goes beyond the typical societal problem about powerful men. And this is because in the church, we have a culture of sidelining these issues, and more than sidelining them, of focusing on things like portraying female sexuality as an irresistible temptation to men. So women, you better cover up, or those men won't be able to control themselves. This kind of thinking opens a door to assault and makes it harder for women to come forward and report what has happened to them for fear of being labeled promiscuous or temptresses in some way. The church needs to stop calling out the rest of society on their sexual immorality and deal with our own glaring moral failure in this area. No one cares what we have to say anymore anyway. We lost all credibility that we might have had on this issue. But if we want a truly Christian way to think about sex, we need to start here with justice, with consent, with power dynamics. This has to be forefront in our Christian thinking. So justice should be our first step in building a Christian sexual ethic. But it shouldn't be our last. Contemporary sexual ethics often begin and end with consent and power dynamics. But I think there's more we can consider for a Christian perspective. So the second factor I want to suggest is the concept of agape, by which I mean godly love. This is the main Greek word used in the New Testament for love. It is not the most common word in ancient Greek. It's actually a pretty rare word in ancient Greek. Other words are much more common, like the word eros for sexual or romantic love, the word philia for the friendship bond between people. These come up all the time. Agape does not. New Testament authors grabbed the term agape to use to describe the kind of love that God shows. Unconditional love, love that seeks the best for others, that's willing to serve the well-being of other people. How can agape inform our sexual ethic? I think one thing that's key is however we approach our sexuality, it should be a blessing to the well-being of other people, everyone we're around. How we carry our sexuality and how we practice it should be a blessing to others. And we should question any approach to sex that results in objectifying or using other people just to meet our needs. Now, of course, for most of us, eros, that is sexual desire, will and should play a role in our sexuality. So I'm not saying like there's some weird form of like Christian sexuality that's like we just have pure selfless love for others and we don't have any desire. Like that's ridiculous. Of course, it's part of who we're made to be. It's part of how sex is made to work. But eros is fickle. It comes and goes with our hormones, with our situation, with our stage of life. We have varying amounts of sexual desire. Some of us have little to none at all. And we can't necessarily control that desire, like who we have it for, who we have attraction to. Agape is a choice we can always make. Eros is also a self-oriented feeling. Now that doesn't make it bad. Again, that's part of who we are, and that's part of sexual relationships, right? Like you kind of want your sexual partner to enjoy it, right? To be getting something out of it. So it's not bad that eros is part of it. Some of us actually need to get more in touch with the eros side of ourselves if we have suppressed it due to shame or fear or the ways we've been taught to think negatively about sexuality in general. But the point here is that if we let eros run the show, we're going to treat people as objects for our use rather than as precious human beings worthy of God's love and our own. One other important thing to say about agape before I move on. Agape can go wrong. Some of us are prone to losing ourselves in relationships, to sort of suppressing our own needs, our own desires, even letting our own boundaries be crossed in order to make someone else happy, to please our partner. And we need to watch out for that. Also, women are often socialized to always submit their needs to the needs of others. This is not agape. True agape goes both ways in relationships. It prioritizes right and whole relationship. When I think about agape, I always think about Jesus. Jesus was selfless and sacrificing and serving others and lifting them up and humanizing them. But he wasn't going to not say what was true. He wasn't going to let people push him off task or what he needed to do. He was strong, right? Agape is strong. This is why it's so helpful for us to work through our own sexual ethic ahead of time, to start that work now if you haven't done much thinking about it, so that when others ask of us sexually in the future, we're already sure of our own convictions and our priorities, our own timeline and what we want. My third category to think about in building a Christian ethic about sex is the trickiest of them, especially for Christians approaching sexuality from different ends of the traditional progressive spectrum, and that is commitment. If you lean more toward the traditional side on this one, this is going to really resonate for you. This is where marriage fits in. This is where classical views, the views that the church has held for 2,000 years, at least the core ones around sex, it all fits into this commitment category. But some folks on the more progressive side might find your defenses going up, even as I mention this category. Because commitment is the value that has most been weaponized against people. Queer and feminist critics and others have demonstrated how marriage has been used historically to oppress people, to oppress women, to exclude those who can't or won't conform, like queer people. We've already talked about how that was the case in the patriarchal world the Bible was written in. It's also true in recent American history. In her book, Moral Combat, Marie Griffith records how women's rights movements, from the seeking the right to vote through workplace rights and all these things, all along the way, have been opposed on the grounds they would damage their fitness as wives and mothers, or that they would lead to promiscuity and unfaithfulness to their husbands. Marriage has been weaponized to keep women down. And some folks are rejecting marriage specifically because of its very prominent role in enforcing hierarchies, oppression, and excluding people who don't conform. So I recognize that even raising the issue of commitment can put some of us on the defensive. Where is this going, Chris? So I just want to reiterate, I'm not here to dictate anyone else's sexuality, and I especially don't want to pressure anyone or suggest that anyone should create a sexual ethic that contributes to harm that has already been done to you in some way. Our sexual ethic should give us life. It can be hard, but it should give us life and not be destructive. But I do want to share from my own perspective how commitment can be an important ethical category for Christian relationships, and that it deserves our attention if we can give it. For Christians, commitment in our relationships is meant to reflect God's commitment to us. We have in the Bible the Hebrew word chesed, which stands for, and gets translated as God's steadfast love. Steadfast is a beautiful word, right? It's like standing firm, like God's love does not move. God's commitment towards us does not move. It's a love that sticks through ups and downs, a love that doesn't give up or get tired and move on. Ideally, it's the kind of love that marriage is supposed to embody, although we all know that many marriages do not embody this, and many marriages do not last through all the ups and downs. For my part, I'm in favor of keeping marriage. I'm married, obviously, and I'm in favor of a redemptive approach to marriage that brings out its best aspects. So, Lorraine and I have found our partnership together to be this great source of life and strength and support. There's something really powerful about knowing that we're with each other for the long haul, even if we're not feeling it, that we've made this commitment to be there. And so that sense that there's never that sense of we're teetering on losing that partner we have. There's something really cool about that. Our marriage is an egalitarian marriage. It's totally equal. There's no hierarchy, or if we sniff it out, we try to get rid of it. Our marriage is meant to bless us, bless our daughter, those who interact with us. And we mean it for it to be the kind of thing that exists and is a blessing, but does not put any kind of pressure or expectation that other people would be in the same kind of relationship, same kind of arrangement. But I need to say, and this does not get said enough in the church, that while, of course, commitment is beautiful, but commitment exists outside of marriage too. There's many kinds of commitment, ways of living out committed relationships. There's many levels of commitment in a relationship. And so I want to suggest that rather than thinking in binaries, are you married or not? Are you in a life partnership or not? That it might be helpful to view commitment, along with trust, as something that we increase over time in a relationship. And that we can correlate our physical intimacy with that commitment, so that our physical intimacy increases as the commitment increases. I found this to be a helpful paradigm. I don't know if everyone else will. When I look back at my relationship with Lorraine and those years of dating and our friends trying to navigate this, I think about maybe part of why it was so hard to negotiate these rules is that physicality does not fit neatly into a binary of married or not. Since it's not easy to define things like what actually counts as sex or what physical things are okay as not, it might make a lot more sense to think about them as increasing in a gradual timeline as our physicality or as our commitment increases. As long as we're talking about physical intimacy, there's actually quite a bit of evidence that sex works best where there's trust and commitment in relationships. Our sexuality is one of our most vulnerable places. And our sexual experiences leave, both positive and harmful, leave lasting neurological impressions on us. So there's something to be said about creating a safe space in which sexual intimacy can happen. Again, I'm not here to lay down rules. I don't know what I would say if I was. And I don't believe that there is one perfect, one-size-fits-all solution. But I offer commitment as an important consideration in a Christian approach to sex. Now I'm going to address the other question, which I'm sure some of you have been thinking since I began. Yes, Chris, but what about sin? Aren't holiness and purity important too? In his book, Beyond Shame, Matthias Roberts, who is a queer therapist and theologian, reckons with the overwhelming sexual shame that he's encountered in many of his Christian clients. He writes, "In our faith communities, more and more people are waking up to the harms of purity culture, and many of us suffer from overwhelming shame around our sex lives or lack of sex lives. We don't know what we're doing, and we feel shame about that. Or we do know what we're doing, and we've been told that because we have sexual experience, no one will love us, and we feel shame about that. We feel shame about the people we're attracted to and when. We feel shame day in and day out, and it seems no one is talking about it, leaving us all alone to try to figure things out." And it's worth pointing out that you don't have to have experienced moral failure under this way of thinking to internalize a deep sense of shame and anxiety around sexuality. For Christians, the concept of purity and holiness derives from the Old Testament law, which operates on the assumption that certain things, like exposure to a dead body, or menstrual blood, or semen, or foods that you eat, all these things can make you unclean, including moral behavior. And that being unclean means you are unfit for contact with the holy, things that are holy, until you have been ritually cleansed and made clean again. Uncleanness was contagious. A defiled person could defile other people, so they had to be kept separate from others, and especially kept separate from holy things, the things of God, the places of God, like the temple. Now, even though New Testament authors like Paul were adamant that Christians no longer needed to follow cleanliness laws, that these didn't apply, they still imported holiness and purity language into their teachings about morality. I think because it was so formative for them and how they thought about morality. And not just them, but ancient cultures in general. Greco-Roman cultures cared about purity and holiness. So when Paul scolds his Christian converts in the city of Corinth for continuing to visit temple prostitutes, he writes to them, "Do you not know that your bodies are members of Christ? Should I therefore take the members of Christ and make them members of a prostitute? Never." Now, this is an argument based on a logic of holiness and defilement. You have the holy God in you. A prostitute is sexually defiled. How can you bring God in contact with defilement? You are defiling God. And it's a strong logic that would have worked on Paul's audience. They would have said, "Oh, no, I can't do that. That's inappropriate." The problem for us is that our brains are hardwired to worry about defilement in a way that means we can't just treat this as a metaphor for sin. Our cognitive circuitry protects us from infection and disease by making us feel disgust at things like human feces or blood or mucus, pus, and mold. If you're having I could have put pictures up and that would have really done it. If you're having a reaction to those things, it's because the circuitry in your brain is trying to keep you from being poisoned and keep you safe. Surprisingly, our moral sense of this is wrong is tied to the same circuitry in our brains as that disgust mechanism, which is why we can have moral disgust, like in Paul's argument, in the same way that we can have disgust at something like moldy food. Our brain literally puts them together. And it does the same with people. This is why some people who've had COVID-19 and recovered find that they are being stigmatized by people around them. When people find out they had COVID, people keep a distance. They don't want to be near them. It's because in the brains of those people, that person has been associated with the infection. And the circuitry in their brain is saying infected, defiled, stay back. Even though they're probably the safest people that you could be around when it comes to COVID. We do the same with moral things. This is why people stigmatize women who violate sexual norms. And the women, they don't just it's not just that they've done something to violate the norm, it's that they've become a slut. And it's a very harmful term. The reason that term has such a powerful resonance when I say the word slut is because it is a term of defilement. Frankly, I find Paul's argument in 1 Corinthians 6 troubling, because to work, it requires seeing another person, this person who, for whatever reason, is working as a prostitute. We have to consider this person as hopelessly defiled, someone who should be kept away from God, someone that God would never want to unite with. That's the only way that moral logic works, that Paul is laying down. We can also direct that feeling against ourselves. When we fail to maintain sexual holiness or purity, we become defiled in our own minds, which results in self-loathing and shame. You can't be told your whole life you need to stay holy in your sexuality, you need to stay pure in your sexuality, and not have that then affect you when you fail at those things. To internalize that as not just I'm a failure, not just I sinned and needed forgiveness, but our mental wiring is telling us that we are defiled. That even if we believe in forgiveness, God doesn't want to be near us. We can't be near it. We can't come near to God. This is why after you do something you consider a sexual sin, it's so hard right afterward to pray and say, God, can you forgive me for that? Because you feel a deep sense of defilement and shame inside you. I want to propose an alternative to holiness and purity thinking, which is to suggest that we think in terms of spiritual transformation. Rather than things I must do things I must avoid in order to keep pleasing God, I think it's more helpful to ask, how is God calling me to grow as a person? Bromley McClenaghan has this great quote: "The Christian life is less about protecting ourselves from being profaned and more about learning to risk ourselves in love." See that change in mindset? So in terms of spiritual transformation, we can ask, who is the future me that God is inviting me to become? Maybe someone who has more agape for others and towards myself than I am now. Maybe I'm becoming someone who practices virtues like patience, gentleness, and self-control. These could all inform my sexuality. Is my sexual ethic helping me to become that person? If it's not, I need to change it. Right? I need to move that direction. One big benefit of this is it keeps us from constantly focusing on the things we shouldn't do, which is a real problem. Like we're constantly thinking about what we shouldn't do, the sins we should avoid. We're still thinking about those sins. It's not helpful to us. And instead, putting the focus on where we're trying to go. Like that old advice about if you find yourself getting into a car accident and what you don't want to do is you don't want to look at the thing you're trying to avoid hitting. You want to look away from it, right? To where you want to go. And that's where you're going to steer. Let's look toward the positive us that we think God is inviting us to become. Also, this makes room to accept ourselves and our sexuality as positive aspects of who we are. The person you are becoming in God is still a sexual being. The beautiful person God is making you to be is a fully sexual being. So how are you going to live and thrive in that sexuality? Finally, and very briefly, I want to make a call back to what I said at the beginning, which is we need a wise approach to a sexual ethic. We need something that's going to work. Wisdom means learning to make good decisions in a morally complicated world. And the Bible emphasizes it. The Bible tells us we need wisdom because it's not always clear what we should do. You can't always just open the page of your Bible and know the answer to everything. We have a lot to figure out. We need wisdom. But wisdom is not automatic. It grows over time. We learn from both our successes and our mistakes, and we're going to make mistakes, including sexual ones. So let's be patient with ourselves. This is a long-term learning journey. We don't have to know all the answers right now. We just need to take whatever next step we're being invited to take. And in light of that, I want to invite you to think about this for yourself. In a few minutes, we're going to be firing up a Zoom call. I think at 7 o'clock, we'll be firing up a Zoom call for anyone who's already part of the CCF chat on Facebook Messenger. We're going to post a link there. If you're not on that chat, if you're an older alum who hasn't really been part of the community in the last couple of years and not involved in that chat, but you still want to talk about this, I would love to talk with you. Reach out to me if you want to. Maybe we can form some group of alumni, older alumni who'd like to talk about this. But until the Zoom call starts, I'm going to give you some reflective space to think about your own sexual ethic. Feel free to use my suggested framework or not. I'm not the only perspective on this. You can bring in other values or priorities that make sense to you. I'm going to put that up right now. There'll be a slide, about 4 minutes of music, and with these these categories to reflect on. And then Paris will hop back on and give us directions before the 7 o'clock Zoom call. Thank you all very much. It's been nice to talk to you.
Everyone, just with another really riveting talk. It was great. I hope that you have an amazing weekend. being sexual, and I'm seeing one while cry from like the and like part two, of course, is emails CCF. So join us discussing it.